Want to thank you all as me and my family have needed some time and some space that you were able to give that to us. And I'm not fully back, but I did tell Pastor Skip that I could take some sermons off his hands, and so I also thank him and the great job that he was doing and leading the church and the preaching through the weeks. So I thank you all for that very, very much. I don't thank him for the chapter that he gave me, though. If you have read through the Judges 19, it would be more than an R-rated movie if it was made into a film. And so this morning we are going to walk through the chapter of Judges 19, and then I'm going to give at the end a lesser application and then a greater application for us to apply to our lives. I think there's a little bit of ringing, but I know that Brad and his apt abilities is fixing that for us. So, Judges 19, let's start in verse number 1. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, the key thing in this entire chapter starts at the very beginning. There was no king in Israel. There was anarchy in Israel. There wasn't anyone ruling over the people of Israel. Yes, there were judges, but judges were for external threats, stopping Philistines and that sort of thing. This had no rulership or government of the people. There was no king in Israel. There was instead anarchy. And it says there was a certain Levite. Now, the way this is phrased, I would say it is most likely the same Levite that we saw in chapter 17 and 18. That would be the one that was hired to the highest bidder. Now, perhaps there are multiple roaming Levites in the hill country of Ephraim for some reason. Either way, whether it's the same guy or a different one, he's not in any way a moral man. Even though he's a Levite, supposed to be in service to the temple of God. Now, this Levite, who was wandering in the remote parts of Ephraim, took to himself a concubine. And you may have read through the Bible and wondered, what in the world even is a concubine? A concubine is a bonded relationship, but that has a lesser status than a legal wife. The closest thing we have in the U.S. is some states, Florida does not, some states have the idea of a common law marriage, where you live with your girlfriend enough time, and so there are certain legal things like tax codes that you can qualify for, but it is under the status of a full legal marriage. Concubinage was tolerated in the Old Testament, but it was never commanded or promoted. So biblically, a wife then, what's the difference between a wife and a concubine? A wife is considered a free woman who entered of her own volition. A concubine is considered a slave. A wife has a wedding ceremony. A concubine does not. A wife has a dowry that even upon divorce returns back to her. A concubine has no dowry. A wife in the Old Testament had a legal recourses in some instances to file for divorce. A concubine could never. A wife's children belonged to her. Makes sense? A concubine's children were not her own and belonged either to the legal wife, if the man had a wife and multiple concubines, or to the husband. The wife had the protection of inheritance upon death of a husband. A concubine could be given an inheritance out of mercy, but there was no legal obligation to do so. So why would a woman enter into a concubinage instead of full marriage? Some had no choice. They were forced into it, whether through conquering or slavery. Others, who especially knew of a rich man, figured, well, good enough. He'll take care of me. He's rich. I'll enter into this, and saw it as a way to security in a very unsecure world. It is interesting of where they come from. This Levite, this immoral Levite, who took on this lesser than a wife concubine, this live-in girlfriend from Bethlehem. It's almost the exact opposite of another couple we see in Bethlehem, of Mary and Joseph, of this righteous couple doing the right thing, in contrast to this couple that is not living as God's law requires. So in verse 2, his concubine, it says, was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. So this word here for unfaithful, sometimes we can think of as adultery, and it could mean that, but it could also just mean that she was angry and so she left the guy. Regardless, she leaves and goes with her father back to her dad's house, and she's gone for 4 months. It takes the guy 4 months to kind of ruminate on what to do. Verse 3, then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her, to bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. So he waits for 4 months, over a quarter of a year. He kind of ruminates while she's gone. And then he decides, I'm going to go speak kindly and nice and try to get her back. It took him a while to calm down, but now he wants to sweet talk her into coming back to his home. Her dad is glad he is there and views it like a family reunion, wanting them both to stay. He's okay with this arrangement. He wants him, he wants her, he wants them all to stay. Let's have a party for a few days. And so in verse number 4, and his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay and remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. They have a 3-day party, verse 5. And on the 4th day, they arose early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go. So the two of them sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, be pleased to spend the night, and let your heart be merry. And when the man arose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him, telling him to spend the night there again. So that's 4 days. Verse 8. And on the 5th day, he rose early in the morning to depart, and the girl's father said, strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines. So they ate, both of them. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, behold, now the day was waning toward evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws its close. Lodge here, and let your heart be merry, and tomorrow you shall rise early in the morning for your journey, and then go home. But the man would not spend the night. He rose up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, that is, Jerusalem. So, they have this family reunion, this family party. It said the father made him stay 3 days. And the Levite had enough and completed, he forced him into another day, and then tried again for a 5th day. The thing that strikes me about this chapter is the whole thing is about hospitality. Now, later on, we're going to see a negative hospitality, a wicked kind of anti-hospitality. People actively trying to harm others in a town. But what we see here with this father is manipulative hospitality. It seems like it's nice. It seems like he's being generous, but what he's doing is manipulating them so that his daughter can stay longer time. He's trying to control these people by his social obligation and the customs. This will end up in disastrous consequences because they stayed too late. And rather than getting back home, they had to take lodging in a city that they didn't know was completely wicked. We need to be careful ourselves, especially as I'm contemplating my older years and my children as they're getting older, that when we are using hospitality, we are not actually just using it for manipulation. And you may have come across this in your own life. Oh, you never come and see me. That kind of manipulation of, I'd love to have you over, but you never do. That's not showing hospitality and generosity. That's trying to control someone under the guise of hospitality. Especially those with older children, we must be careful in meddling in their relationships and trying to manipulate them. It says that when a man leaves his father and mother and they become one flesh, we who are parents need to respect that one fleshness and not try to stick our fingers to manipulate the marriages of our children. You may even think you're being good and hospitable, but manipulation is always selfish. So, it says he had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. Verse 11. When they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, come now, Let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it. And his master said to him, We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah. And he said to his young man, Come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah. And so they passed on and went their way. And the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And when he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. So the Levite servant, his slave that was carrying his donkey and his gear, noticed that the sun was setting and they had nowhere to stay. And so he says, the nearest city, the nearest exit off the highway is the city of the Jebusites, Jebus. Let's stay there so that we're not out in the wilderness where there's animals and the weather and thieves. Now, the Jebusites were the Gentile remnants that were not expelled from Israel. They were told to go in there, take the whole land. They left some people remaining, and the Jebusites were one of them. So the Levite refuses to go there because he fears the Gentiles. He fears them because they're not part of the people of God. But the terrible tragedy that would befall them is that the threat doesn't come from pagan Gentiles. It's from those who consider themselves part of God's people, part of Israel. That's where they meet the horror show that is to come. So the Levite and his gang press on, hoping to get to Ramah, which is further north, but land in Gibeah in the tribe of Benjamin. Once there, no one takes them into their house. This is a negative hospitality once again. Now, hospitality was not just a social custom to care for others, but a moral duty to love your neighbor as yourself, even in the Old Testament. This is strengthened even more for us in the New Testament in Hebrews 13:2. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. This is hearkening back to Abraham himself, who hospitably took in 3 angels before they were on their way to rescue Lot in Sodom. Hospitality is a high Christian moral virtue, and we ought to be hospitable people. Now, in this day and age, it was taking by random travelers into their home and making sure they had food and lodging, and the host would provide all that for them. In our day and age, it may look different. But it's more than just having your people you like over for dinner. If anything, it's having people you don't like over for dinner. It's taking care of the donations for helping the poor in Guatemala to get ovens and water filtration systems. That's also a mode of hospitality, and we ought to be hospitable people. But that was lacking in this city until, verse number 16, behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim. He was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjaminites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw a traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, Where are you going? And where do you come from? And he said to him, We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah and am going to the house of the Lord. But none has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys. We eat with bread and wine for me and your female servant and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything. And the old man said, Peace be with you. I will care for your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square. So he brought them into his house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. So, an old farmer comes in from the field. He sees them, tells them they can't stay in the city square, begs them to stay somewhere else for the night. The Levite mentions that, well, if you take us in, you don't have to feed my animals, and we have bread, and we have wine. Now, normally it was the host that would provide things. Here, the guest is providing things. It's a reversal of hospitality. But the farmer is game for a spontaneous party after his long day of working in the fields. And so he says, Sure, come on in. Stay with me. Verse 22, this party, however, goes poorly. As they were making their hearts merry, so they're eating the bread, they're drinking the wine, they're having fun, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows. surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house that we may know him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not bring this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now, violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man do not do this outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them, and they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. The thing about the Bible is it captures for us the brutality of real life. That it's not just in some fairy tale land where everything works out okay, but atrocities and wickedness happen. This story is horrific, and it's supposed to be. We're not supposed to like it. Men who have no worth is these worthless fellows. They're good-for-nothing guys. They being controlled by their base desires only and contributing nothing that is good and honorable to the world. That's what this worthless fellows mean. They beat on the door, demanding to violate the guest in the old farmer's house. The farmer offers his own daughter and the Levite's concubine to satiate them and to save his own skin. And the Levite doesn't object. It's the farmer that offered the concubine that belongs to the Levite, and the Levite says, "I'm okay with that." And notice what he says to them. "Do with them what seems good to you." Good. There's no good here. There was no king in Israel, you see, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This has been repeated over and over again in the book of Judges. The thing about this story isn't just that the atrocity happened. It's that these people felt justified in doing it. They thought this was good. They thought they deserved it. They thought that this was their right to take it. They thought they were doing right in their eyes. They thought they were owed the sins that they had committed. The Levite then actively grabs the concubine and shoves her out the door, where, to keep it to the biblical language only, they abused her all night until she collapsed on the doorstep in the morning. If this story sounds kind of familiar to you, it's because the same thing almost happened in another city in the Bible. The city named the wickedest in Genesis, Sodom. An absolute, not only pagan city, but a depraved city where every thought that they had was on wickedness. And that was in a pagan land. Israel has now descended into Sodom. The people that are supposed to be the people of God, the beacon to all the pagan nations around them of the one true, living, and holy God, are now as wicked as Sodom itself. We need to be very careful that we who call ourselves the name of God as Christians do not descend into a vile state justifying our sins. It is incredibly easy to, from your perspective, to justify yourself in wickedness. And it starts with little things. Well, this isn't a big sin, so it's okay. I don't have to confess that. I'll just move on. Oh, this is a little bit bigger, but it's not that big a deal. I'm not as bad as other people, until you think that doing absolute atrocities is right and good. Verse 27, "And her master rose up in the morning, and when he had opened the doors to the house, he went out to go his way. Behold, there was his concubine laying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, 'Get up, let's be going.' But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away from his home." This man is disgusting. Notice how the language is used here. At the beginning of the chapter, in verse number 2, the Levite was referred to as her husband. Now, in verse 27, he's just her master. Before there was a relationship. Now she's just a slave. She's just property. In fact, this word master is the exact same way that his donkey slave, who was leading the donkey around, who referred to him when he told him to go to the Jebusite town. This disgusting man, upon seeing her, just says, "Get up, we're leaving." Somewhere along the way, this woman dies. And then in verse number 29, and when he'd entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her, limb by limb, into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak." What in the world? So, he cuts her body up into 12 pieces and sends each piece to the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, he doesn't do this in grief over the poor woman. She is not but just his property. It's because a crime was committed against him. It was his property that was taken and abused. Therefore, he wants justice for himself, not justice for her. He's only thinking selfishly of his own interests. Nevertheless, he does call Israel to action, and next week we'll see an Israeli civil war where the rest of the tribes gather together to go against the Benjaminites. Sometimes it takes getting things really, really horrible before people finally move to take action. You see, this has been brewing for a long time, where people were getting progressively wickeder and more sinful, more evil, but you just kind of get used to it. It's like that slowly raising of the temperature where you don't really realize how hard it is until someone takes things way farther than you ever thought it was going to be, and then that moves people to action. Now, I think this should give us some humility in our own day and age as things look wicked and look evil, that this is not the most sinful time in all of history. Sometimes we look and say, things have never been this bad. Well, maybe in the course of our country, but not in the course of all of human history. I have never been out of state and stayed at a Holiday Inn and had all of the town of Atlanta, Georgia come knocking on my door, thankfully. Without a king, they all did what was right to them, what was right in their own eyes, from everyone in this story, actually. They were not just moral relativists saying, well, what's right for you is right for me. They were justified in themselves in whatever evil they wanted as if it was the moral thing to do. They called good evil and evil good. The concubine did what was right in her eyes and was unfaithful. The girl's father did what was right in his own eyes and manipulated them with his hospitality. The worthless fellows did what was right in their own eyes for a violent lust. The old farmer did what was right in his eyes by making a sinful deal with them. The Levite did what was right in his eyes with an utter lack of any compassion whatsoever. The ability of people, not just then but now, to self-justify is astounding. 1 Timothy 4:12 talks of those who have a seared conscience. It's literally the ability to tell morality has been cauterized. If you ever have a wound that you need quickly disinfected, you cauterize it. You get a very hot piece of metal and put it against it to stop the bleeding. But what that does is it damages the nerves and prevents them from sending pain signals to your brain. This is exactly the word that 1 Timothy 4:12 talks about with a seared conscience. There's consciences, the thing inside of every single human being, both saved and unsaved. God has given a conscience to feel guilty about right and wrong. They have seared their conscience so they no longer can. They think that evil is fine. They no longer feel the sting of guilt or shame, and thus they lose all moral ability to know right from wrong. Going through this chapter, I noticed something that was glaringly absent. God is not mentioned in this chapter at all. He's not present. not only is his name not present, these people aren't living as if he is real. They are living in a completely secularized mindset, doing whatever they want to do out of their own passions and lusts, doing whatever is right in their own eyes. Okay, this is the book of Judges. So another thing that's absent is, where are the judges? Aren't the judges supposed to come in during Israel's time of captivity and time of trouble and save the day? We've seen judge after judge after judge. From here on out, we actually don't see any more judges in the book of Judges. See, the judges were only there to fight external threats in time of emergency. They were there to fight the Philistines. They were there to fight the Jebusites. They were there to fight other people that would come in. They were totally insufficient for ruling a people. What they needed was a king. They needed government. Now, we as Americans, we don't like kings very much. But the point here is there was no government at all. Yes, judges took care of the external threats, but the internal threat was much more dangerous. The decay of a populace morally. There was only anarchy. And anarchy is not freedom. You think of anarchy as doing whatever you want. The problem is, yeah, you do whatever you want, and everybody else does whatever they want as well. Anarchy, even in real-life history, only plays out for a very short period of time. Because soon, eventually, the stronger dominate the weak. And then there is no more anarchy. Now there is simply the strong oppressing the weak. In anarchy, the strong rule. But it's not just that they did evil things and they knew it. They enjoyed it. Okay. So how do we apply this? Let me give you now a lesser application and then a greater one. Lesser application comes right from the Apostle Paul in Romans 13. Hear these words. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror of good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. We, Christians, have a duty to submit to the civil government. And now in your mind, you'll think of all these different exceptions. Yes, 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 there are exceptions. There are things that we do not violate. They tell us not to preach Jesus. Well, of course, we ignore that. There are limitations to government power. However, even a wicked, tyrannical government is a safer, more peaceful place than anarchy. Because what we have here is no order, no structure for society. It's not even an oppressive order. It's no order at all. We need to be very careful, realizing that the civil government is there to carry out vengeance. It's the avenger of the wrongdoer. Vengeance is not ours. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. And how does he do that? He uses civil government and magistrates to avenge. And he says there that we must then be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, not only because we don't want to be lawbreakers and therefore suffer penalty. That's not actually persecution. But also for the sake of conscience. If the government says to do something that is legal and lawful and moral, and those are three different terms, but if it has those three criteria, we are duty-bound as Christians to obey, not just so that we don't get in trouble, but so that our consciences stay intact. Because once we lose our conscience, we become like these with no conscience. That's the lesser application, how we live in this world. And yes, it's hard, and yes, it's difficult. And yes, even Paul wrote this in a time of persecution, so it doesn't mean in every instance that we submit to the government, in every whim that they have. However, our general stance needs to be one of submission and only disobedience when pushed or prodded, as well as it belongs to us, the Bible says, live at peace with all men. Here's the greater application. We just read in the catechism question, how does God work on behalf of his people? By prophet, priest, and king. The prophet is those who speak for God to us. A priest speaks for us to God. A king rules. In Keach's Catechism, question 29, it says this: how does Christ execute the office of a king? How does he rule as a king? The answer is Christ executes the office of a king in subduing us to himself. We are the first to be conquered. We must be the first to bend a knee. Because the only two real options are either kingship of Christ or anarchy. One leads to the other. You can't have a hybrid of the two. And so we must first subdue ourselves unto the rulership, the lordship of Jesus Christ. But the answer goes on. In ruling and defending us. Christ is our defender in the office of a king. He stands up for us. That even though wickedness reigns in this world, we have one who can not only destroy body, but soul and body in hell, and him only should we fear. We don't fear the external factors. We don't fear what may come or what government may do. We submit to the one who rules and defends us, and then the answer goes on, and in restraining, in conquering all his and our enemies. He restrains them from doing as evil as they possibly could, and he conquers them. The most quoted passage, the prophecy of Jesus in the New Testament, comes from the book of Psalms, which says, "The Lord said to my Lord, I will make your enemies your footstool. Today you are my son, I have begotten you, I will make the enemies your footstool." He will subdue all the nations of the earth, all the wrong, all the evil, all the sin, and he will make it right. How does he rule over us? Well, he gave us 10 commandments, and that's a pretty good start. Do not have other gods. Do not make idols. Do not take God's name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not covet. These things, they're not a restraint to us, they give us actual freedom. Because this anarchy, this isn't freedom. Following the righteous rule of Christ the King, that is freedom. Because the opposite is also true. If you have no other gods, that means God belongs to you. If you do not make idols, it means that you don't follow some dumb piece of wood, but you follow the living God. If you don't take God's name in vain, it means that you honor and revere him in worship and praise. If you remember the Sabbath day, it means you don't have to work like a dog every single day for 24 hours. If you honor your father and mother, the alternative is that you have a horrible relationship with your parents. If you, instead of murdering everybody, you're loving them. Instead of committing adultery, you have a clean conscience because of faithfulness. Instead of stealing, you work hard and diligently to give to others in generosity. Instead of lying to others, well, man, you get to live as a genuine person. Instead of coveting, you can have thankfulness for what God has actually done for you. You see, God, as he rules over us as king, gives us freedom, not bondage. He did this because he died on the cross for us. And then he rose again. And it says in that resurrection, he conquered death, hell, and the grave. Our greatest enemies, he is already defeated, and we wait until they are the full consummation of his return. Ultimately, there is either the kingdom of God or there is anarchy. So I ask you, will Jesus be your king? Will he rule over you? Or will you do what is right in your own eyes and descend into anarchy? There ultimately aren't any other choices. And speaking for myself, I need a king. I need a king who rules and reigns. A king that I submit myself to, because this world is confusing. This world doesn't make sense. This world is odd and strange, and things happen that you never thought or expected. This world is also dangerous. This isn't far from the news of what we just read. This world has terrors and atrocities. It has poverty and oppression. I need a king to rule over me. I need a king to defend me. I need a king to guide me and show me the way, that when the world seems like it's crumbling around me and doesn't make sense, the sure and steadfast anchor of my soul in the Bible itself leads me and guides me and provides me light. Why is the word a lamp unto my feet? Because the rest of the world is dark. I need a king. And beloved, this king calls you today to bow before him and submit your life to him. Not so that he can take freedom from you, but so that he can give freedom to you and live the life that you were always meant to live. So Pastor Skip is going to come and lead us in a time of reflection. I want you to ask your question: will Jesus be your king? Or are you going to follow what is right in your own eyes in mere anarchy and disaster?